I am not here to speak about healthcare per se. Of course, we're talking broadly about climate change and its effect on our health, and I'm going to use my small window of time to strike a more personal tone about how climate change affects our mental health and affects our ability to be well, really. So as you listened to those two talks, I'm sure some of you felt overwhelmed. It is overwhelming to think about increasing rates of heat-related death, and it is overwhelming to think of the incredible inequity around environmental justice, as was just described. And climate change is overwhelming. It's a lot of information to integrate, and it is that sense of overwhelm that I actually want to speak about, with the basic premise being that until we can sort of move through that and past that, we may not actually engage this issue. Before I strike that more personal note, I just want to make a couple comments about climate change very, very broadly to make sure that we really are all on the same page about the facts. I'll draw from an interview with the author Davis Wallace Wells, who recently published a book called The Uninhabitable Earth, and just pull a couple salient facts from his comments that I think sort of lay the framework. Simply put, we have too much carbon in the atmosphere. We've been actively taking it out of the earth and putting it into the atmosphere. And one key fact to know is that that is accelerating. Half of all the carbon in our atmosphere arrived there within the past 30 years. And so it is stressful to recognize that the time window for real action is not only narrow, but it's narrowing, and it's narrowing quickly. Also, the fact is that only really broad, collective, collaborative action will quantitatively move the needle on climate change. We are essentially in the process of exiting the fossil fuel era. It's not a question of if we will do that. It's a question of how and how quickly and how well, or how painfully. And so again, that is all very overwhelming. We haven't really spoken about COVID today. And I just want to say that I think we've all learned a lot about ourselves, about our families, our communities, and about the world this year through COVID. A couple of things that I think are interesting that we have learned from ourselves, some of which actually may be reassuring. We learned that actually, to some degree, really broad global collective action is possible. Early in 2020, billions of people on this planet pivoted their behavior quickly and with very little notice. It wasn't universal cooperation, but billions of people stayed home from work and school, and that is fantastic. But we also learned that we collectively lack endurance and seem to lack stamina, and there's a lot of really real reasons why it is hard to endure that level of change. And finally, I would say that we learned that how we communicate science really matters, and that individuals' minds can be our primary obstacle to implementing what may seem like very common sense solutions. Certainly universal masking should be a lot easier than fixing climate change. And we see what sort of happened around that and the politicization of that. So again, a few facts on climate change, a little bit about us, what we've learned this year as a species, as a people. And now I just want to turn really to our individual mind. I am not using slides, so rest your eyes, rest your neck. You could consider this an audio if you want. It'll just be me here. So again, we were posed the question, how is climate change affecting our health? And like I already said, many of us feel overwhelmed. And I want to say that that is to be expected. Psychology, the basic psychological theory would say that, yes, it is normal to feel very overwhelmed by these realities and by these facts. As we speak right now, there is a Category 4 hurricane in the Gulf, and it went from Category 1 to 4 overnight. We have wildfires in California. Yes, this is very overwhelming, and there's tons of information. And so it's worth just giving ourselves some credit that it's okay to feel overwhelmed. But I want to talk a little bit about that because at some point we got to move past it, right? So there is a theory that some of you may be familiar with called cognitive dissonance, and it was first described in 1957 by a social psychologist. And what he said is that when we are forced to cope with contradictory ideas, this creates stress in our minds. And this requires energy and it requires effort, and it leads to fatigue in the mind. Bear with me here for a second. When we have facts that maybe seem opposite or opposed, this leads to sort of internal inconsistencies. And we start to notice when maybe something that we know doesn't match our behavior, and this all sort of adds to our psychological discomfort. With this state in our minds, then our emotions become affected. And some of you may have had feelings of guilt or shame or just fatigue or just denial, anxiety, fear, all of these sort of emotions in response to the information that just doesn't quite fit in our current framework. And, you know, in line with the talks that we heard just now, as North Americans, we carry additional sense of guilt because we know that our country emits the vast majority of the carbon and that we are somewhat complicit. We are in fact the cause of this major global problem. You know, we'd like to believe that we're good actors in a fair world. And so this discomfort grows. And so the theory predicts that our mind has a natural impulse, which will be to resolve or reduce that discomfort. And the way that we do that is by pushing away facts, by choosing what to believe, by justifying some behaviors, and sometimes by avoiding circumstances or information that would increase our distress. And this can manifest in really innocent ways, like, I just can't read another article about climate change, it's too much, I just can't think about it, I get so worked up. And again, this is all normal and this is all actually predicted, but we're left with the question, is there a healthier or more productive way to resolve this mental emotional state? In his book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, George Marshall makes what I think is a very powerful comparison. And he compares climate science communication to a really bad religion that offers guilt and blame and fear, but no recourse to salvation or forgiveness. And if we pause, you know, we can see what he means, because there is this sense that it's all fire and brimstone and there's this language of apocalypse, and it's natural for our chests to get tight and to think, oh my gosh, I can't handle this. And so what George Marshall proposes, and I agree with, and it's one of the points I want to just put before you today, is that we really need a language of hope and shared values and forgiveness if we are going to transform our guilt and anxiety into something more productive. So where does this leave the individual? Many of us want to be good people. We want to have integrity. And sometimes we just don't know what our behavior should be in the face of this huge body of knowledge around climate change. And the question often arises, does it really matter what I do? If I ride my bike to work and nobody else is riding their bike to work, does that really make a difference? And quantitatively, probably it does not. But I would like to propose that qualitatively, our individual behaviors matter quite a lot. And I want to give you two simple reasons why I think that they matter. The first speaks directly to what I was just describing, which is that emotional milieu that many of us move in and out of that is very uncomfortable. Actually, the psychological theory would predict that if we engage in small incremental behavioral changes, that would be a healthy way to reduce the dissonance in our minds. And again, we're not doing these because we think we're going to save the world, but because we're sort of incrementally changing who we are, and we're changing our identity, increasing our awareness, increasing our mindfulness, and thus becoming more able emotionally to engage what is a very complicated issue. And I would just propose as sort of a common sense advice to anybody listening who's wondering, well, what behavior should I change? Start with the win-win behaviors, right? Because it's really sort of a beautiful non-coincidence that the behaviors that will reduce your carbon footprint just so happen to be the behaviors that directly benefit the health of your body and mind, and oftentimes of your bank account. And so think about diet, think about travel, think about spending and consumption, and look for ways to invite simplicity, frugality into those spaces, and you will already be making behavior changes that honor the facts of climate change and can also benefit directly your mental health, as I described. There's another reason why individual behavior matters. Again, less quantitative, more qualitative, but extremely important. And I want to use the example of Greta Thunberg to describe why. So I'm assuming everybody's heard of Greta. And certainly we cannot all be Greta presenting to the United Nations at the age of 15 and being nominated for Nobel Prizes twice before she's 20. But the story of Greta that is actually worth noting is that she went from severe clinical depression to world leadership. And I think it's worth noting how that happened. So when Greta was a child, she learned the facts of climate change. She felt overwhelmed. She became incredibly depressed, truly clinically depressed, didn't eat, lost weight. But she was depressed not because the problem was so big. She was depressed because as a child, she looked around and none of the adults in the room, nobody that she knew, and she couldn't find any examples. No one was doing anything about this. And that is what depressed Greta. Now, it wasn't until her parents started making small concessions to reduce their own carbon footprint that Greta began to have hope again. And then from there, we know the rest of the story. She made the sign, she sat in front of the building, and all of the rest. And so what this describes is the idea of behavioral contagion. This idea that even within our families and in our homes, we need leadership and we need examples and we need inspiration. And there's a beautiful quote by an author, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, that says, "Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching to mend what is within our reach. And it is never for us to know which acts or by whom will cause the critical mass to tip toward an enduring good." And so, yes, your individual behavior matters to the children around you, to the people around you, and probably more importantly to yourself, to your own sense of sort of inner correctness and integrity. I would like to make another comment about children because I talked about Greta. Children have an incredibly important role to play in all of this. You know, Greta essentially was that child in the story that said, "The emperor is naked." And just about any child out there is capable of saying the emperor is naked because they are so honest. Children have hope, they have resiliency, they have creativity, they have much of the energy that we need to face this issue. And I think we should not shy away from sharing the facts with them. Another incredible story about a child is Jane Goodall. So Jane Goodall today is 86 years old. She is a fierce climate activist. And to this day, she cites her mother as being the reason she became who she was. It was because her mother took her ideas seriously. Her mother let her explore. And today, Jane Goodall calls on us all to instill awe in our children as sort of the beginning of mending what she sees as the fundamental problem of our species, which is the disconnect between our minds and our hearts. And so children really can offer us that language of hope, and they can come up with beautiful and creative ideas. I encourage you to take that challenge and speak to whatever children you know and see what solutions they shout out. I know my kids had some really, really creative ones that gave me hope. And on the topic of hope, you know, I think that there is something sort of nostalgically and quintessentially American about hope and optimism, that certainly this obsession with potential and promise as progress has led us down the wrong road many, many times. And yet we have in the threads of our thinkers and our writers, many of the ingredients that we need to deal with this. If you think of writers like Emerson and Thoreau, who brought together nature and nation and imagination, you know, this is an ethos that could help us move towards a really healthy and vibrant future. You know, I mentioned earlier this idea of climate science communication as a very bad religion. And, you know, even in the 70s, Rene Dubos said, "Our salvation depends on our ability to create a religion of nature suited to the needs and the knowledge of modern men and women." And he spoke about a theology of the earth. You know, maybe these words don't resonate for you, but certainly we need a new language that can pull more people into this movement from a space of inspiration. I just have a couple of concluding thoughts. The first is one question that's been raised for me as I thought about this is, are we able to think like a species? You know, I was actually advised not to use that word species in this talk. I was told that people wouldn't understand it, that they would relate more to the idea of belonging to a civilization or a society or a culture, but not to a species. And yet that is what we are essentially talking about, because the Save the Planet movement, in a way, was misbranded. In reality, as we see what Dr. Morris described with the destabilization of our habitats, increasing temperatures, algae blooms, we are essentially going to create habitats that we can no longer live in. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, what we're talking about is the extinction of our species, right? So it's not so much about saving the planet, it's about saving our species. The wildfires in California, the first reports coming out right now are that the 2,000-year-old redwood trees are still standing. And so that is evidence that some of these habitats will survive and we will not. Jane Goodall says, it is bizarre to me that the most intellectual animal is destroying its habitat. So again, this line of thought may feel a little bit scary, but I would just leave you with the question that I'm left with still and don't have an answer to, which is, what does it mean for us to think like a species? So in conclusion, I would just say your overwhelm is normal, but we do need to move past it. And there are ways to do that. I believe that individual behavior is one of them. So begin with the win-win behaviors. Begin with trying to shape your language, even with how you speak with yourself and how you think about this issue. Again, we need hope. We need shared values. We need forgiveness. We need to allow people in who maybe have not been in on this movement, because we may be surprised who comes to the table with some really important solutions here. The goal must be dialogue, and for dialogue, we need a language. Ultimately, your sense of overwhelm will either defeat you and you will stay quasi or unengaged, or it will transform you and we may be part of the most incredible human experiment of all time. And you will definitely have moments of feeling discouraged. To quote the same author that I quoted earlier, she talks about despair and she says, I do not keep a chair for despair at my table. I will not entertain it, and it is not allowed to eat from my plate. So at some point, we need to fend off this despair, and we need to sort of work on this internal journey, because the basic premise here is that until we work on our inner transformation, we will never be able to even imagine the degree of outer transformation that is needed here. There's a lot of work to be done. Thank you so much for including me.